The air was thick with grief, yet I felt nothing. As I stood at the entrance of the funeral home, staring at my sister's casket, I waited for the sorrow to come, for the pain of loss to hit me like it did everyone else. But it didn't. Instead, a cold emptiness settled in my chest, as if my heart had already grieved for her long ago, 10 years ago, to be exact, when she betrayed me in the worst way possible. 10 years ago, I had everything I ever wanted. A loving husband, a secure home, and a sister I trusted more than anyone in the world. Emily had always been my closest confidant, the one who stood by me when life threw its worst. I never questioned her intentions, never doubted the sincerity in her words when she said she was happy for me. But all it took was one night, one revelation, to shatter everything I believed in. I came home to an empty house, a hastily written note, and a reality that knocked the air out of my lungs. My husband and my sister had run away together. There was no warning, no explanation, just a brutal betrayal that left me drowning in agony. The people I loved most had torn my life apart, and I had to pick up the broken pieces alone. Now, after a decade of silence, Emily was gone. And instead of the anger and bitterness I expected to feel, I was left with an unsettling numbness. My mother sobbed uncontrollably beside me, clinging to my arm as if seeking comfort. She had begged me to come, and despite every ounce of resentment I harbored, I had obliged. But nothing could have prepared me for what came next. As the last mourners trickled out, my mother took a deep breath, her tear-streaked face twisted with anguish. And then, in a voice trembling with years of buried secrets, she whispered, "There's something I need to tell you about Emily, something I should have told you years ago." I turned to her, my pulse quickening. I had spent 10 years thinking I knew the truth. But as my mother's words hung in the air, I realized I had no idea what was coming next. A cold chill ran down my spine as I stared at my mother, her eyes clouded with something heavier than grief, guilt. For years, I had buried my emotions, convincing myself that the betrayal was behind me, that I had moved on. But in that moment, as I stood next to my sister's lifeless body, my mother's cryptic words unearthed a wave of emotions I had long suppressed. I swallowed hard. "What are you talking about, Mom?" My voice was quieter than I intended, barely above a whisper. She hesitated, glancing around the nearly empty funeral home as if afraid someone might overhear. "Not here," she muttered. "Come with me." I followed her through the back doors and into the dimly lit hallway that led to a small lounge area. The scent of old flowers and stale coffee lingered in the air, an odd contrast to the heavy weight pressing against my chest. My mother sank onto a worn-out couch, wringing her hands together. "You don't know the full story, Cassid," she began, her voice shaking. "I should have told you a long time ago, but I didn't know how. And now it's too late." I clenched my fists, old wounds ripping open at the mere mention of the past. Too late for what? "She ran away with my husband, Mom. She destroyed my life. What more do I need to know?" She looked up at me then, her face pale, her lips trembling. "Because, Cassid, it wasn't her choice." I blinked. "What?" She exhaled shakily, her hands gripping her lap as if trying to steady herself. "Emily didn't run away with your husband because she wanted to. She did it to protect you." The words hung in the air like smoke, suffocating and impossible to grasp. I shook my head. "That doesn't make sense." "What are you saying?" Tears welled in her eyes as she forced herself to meet my gaze. "Your husband, Daniel, he was not the man you thought he was." A sharp, bitter laugh escaped my lips before I could stop it. "Oh, I know that, Mom. He was a liar, a cheater, and a coward. I figured that out when he disappeared with my sister." She shook her head fiercely. "No, Cassid. It was worse than that. He was dangerous." My stomach twisted into knots. "Dangerous?" She hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath, as if summoning the courage to rip open a wound of her own. "Emily found out something about him, something that could have ruined him. She wanted to tell you, but she was terrified. And then, the night before she left, he threatened her." My pulse pounded in my ears. "Threatened her? With what?" My mother's gaze dropped to her lap. "With you." The room seemed to tilt as the weight of her words crashed into me. What? What do you mean? She swallowed hard. He told her that if she didn't leave with him, if she tried to expose him, he would hurt you. He knew that she would do anything to protect you, so he gave her an ultimatum: leave with him and keep quiet, or stay and risk your life. I stumbled back a step, my breath coming in short, uneven gasps. That's not possible. Why would he do that? What could she have known that was so dangerous? My mother wiped her tears away with trembling fingers. Emily found out that Daniel had a history, a dark one. He wasn't just unfaithful, Cass said. He was violent. He had a record, though he had managed to keep it hidden. Before he met you, he was involved in something terrible, something that should have put him behind bars. Emily found out, and he knew that if she spoke, his life would be over. My knees threatened to give out beneath me. I reached for the armrest of the couch, trying to steady myself. Why didn't she tell me? Why didn't you tell me? My mother let out a broken sigh. Because she didn't want you to suffer. She thought she could handle it. She thought that if she went with him, she could keep you safe and maybe even find a way to bring him down from the inside. But then she disappeared. She never contacted me after that night. I spent years wondering if she was even alive. I felt sick. My whole life, I had believed Emily had betrayed me. I had cursed her name, spent sleepless nights asking myself what I had done to deserve such a cruel fate. But now, everything was unraveling, revealing a truth I had never even considered. I stared at my mother, my vision blurred with tears. Did she ever try to come back? A pained expression crossed her face. I don't know. I spent years looking for her, hoping she'd reach out, but she never did. I thought she was gone forever, until last week, when I got a call. I gripped the couch tighter. A call? From who? Her lip quivered. A hospital. They said Emily had been found in a shelter. She was sick, weak, she didn't have much time left. A sob lodged in my throat. And you didn't tell me? I didn't know how. I didn't want to bring you more pain. But when I got to the hospital, she was barely able to speak. She just kept saying your name, over and over. She asked for you, Cass said. She wanted to tell you herself. Tears slipped down my cheeks. And then she died. My mother nodded, her face crumbling. She never got the chance to explain everything. But she loved you, Cass said. She never stopped loving you. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to hold in the storm raging inside me. The sister I had spent 10 years hating had sacrificed everything to protect me. She had suffered alone, carried a burden too heavy for one person, and I had never even given her the chance to explain. I wiped my tears, my mind racing. If Emily had truly been trying to protect me, then that meant Daniel was still out there. And if he had been willing to destroy my sister to keep his secrets, there was no telling what he might do next. For the first time in a decade, I felt something stronger than grief, stronger than regret. I felt the need for answers. And I was going to get them. A storm raged inside me as I walked out of the funeral home, my mother's words echoing in my head like a haunting melody. My sister hadn't betrayed me, she had saved me. And for 10 years, I had lived with the bitterness of a lie. My breath came in sharp, uneven gasps as I tried to process the weight of it all. I needed answers. I hadn't thought of Daniel in years, had forced myself to bury his memory deep within me like a rotting corpse. But now, he was alive in my mind again, more dangerous than I ever imagined. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone, searching his name, but there was nothing, no social media, no recent records. It was as if he had vanished from existence. But ghosts don't stay buried forever. I clenched my jaw, gripping the phone tighter. I needed to know what had happened after Emily left with him. Had she truly been trapped? Had she been running all this time? And if so, from what? My heart pounded as I made a decision. I had to find out the truth. The next morning, I sat in my car outside an old police precinct, my hands gripping the steering wheel. I had spent all night searching, calling old contacts, trying to piece together fragments of Daniel's past. What I found made my blood run cold. Daniel had been arrested years before he met me, under a different name. Domestic violence, fraud, even suspected involvement in a missing persons case. but somehow he had walked free every time. A chill crept down my spine as I realized Emily hadn't just been protecting me. She had been protecting the world from him. I stepped into the station, my heels clicking against the cold tile. The officer at the front desk barely glanced at me. "Can I help you?" I swallowed my nerves. "I need information on a man named Daniel Wright. Or at least, that's the name he went by when I knew him." The officer sighed, giving me a tired look. "Are you filing a report?" "No," I said quickly. I think he's dangerous, and I need to know if there's anything on him." The officer rubbed his temples. "Ma'am, if there's no active case." I leaned in, lowering my voice. "There was an active case. 10 years ago, my sister ran away with him, and now she's dead. I think she was running from him." That got his attention. He studied me for a long moment before standing. "Wait here." Minutes passed like hours before he returned, a thin file in his hand. "We don't have much. But you're right, Daniel Wright isn't his real name." I took the file, my fingers shaking. I flipped through pages of reports, mugshots, accusations that never stuck. My stomach churned as I read through the police notes, how victims had refused to testify, how he had managed to slip through the cracks. And then I found it. A single, chilling detail that made my breath hitch. A Jane Doe had been found near a motel outside the city 8 years ago. Beaten, left for dead. No ID, no leads. But in the officer's notes, something caught my eye. Suspect, Daniel Wright, known alias. I stared at the page, my blood running ice cold. My sister had vanished 10 years ago. This woman had turned up 2 years later, brutalized but alive. Was it her? Had Emily escaped, only to be hunted down again? I slammed the file shut. I needed to find that motel. The drive to the motel was suffocating, my mind racing through the possibilities. If Emily had escaped, why hadn't she come home? Had she been too afraid? Too ashamed? Or had Daniel found her before she could? The motel was a forgotten relic of the past, its neon sign flickering weakly in the fading daylight. The clerk barely acknowledged me as I walked in, my heart pounding in my ears. "Excuse me," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm looking for information about a woman who was found here years ago. A Jane Doe." The man barely glanced up from his newspaper. "You a cop?" "No," I admitted. "But she was my sister." That made him pause. His eyes flickered with something pity? Recognition? He sighed, setting his paper down. "You mean the girl who was left in the parking lot?" A lump formed in my throat. "Yes." He studied me for a moment before nodding. "She checked in alone. Stayed for a couple of days. Quiet, kept to herself. Then, one night, she disappeared. Found her in the lot the next morning, barely breathing." My hands trembled. "Did anyone come looking for her?" His jaw tightened. "A man came by a few times, asking about her. But after a while, he stopped coming." I swallowed hard. "Do you remember what he looked like?" The man hesitated before nodding. "Tall, dark hair. Looked off. Something about his eyes." He shuddered. Like a man with nothing left to lose. My stomach twisted. It was him. Daniel had hunted her down. I gripped the counter, my mind spinning. If Emily had survived that, then where had she gone? Why hadn't she reached out? And more importantly, was Daniel still looking for me? I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My sister had spent years running, hiding, suffering alone, all to protect me. And I had hated her for it. A sickening realization settled in my gut. Emily had never come home because she was afraid she'd lead Daniel right to me. And now, with her gone, I was the last loose end. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Daniel had disappeared off the grid for years, but what if he was still watching? I glanced at my reflection in the rearview mirror, my pulse hammering. If he thought Emily was his only threat, he was wrong. Because now I knew the truth. And I wasn't running. I was going to find him. And this time, I was going to end it. The air felt heavier than ever as I gripped the cold metal handle of my front door, my pulse hammering against my ribs. I had spent the last decade trying to forget Daniel, trying to erase the scars of his betrayal. But now I knew the truth. He hadn't just betrayed me. He had hunted my sister, forced her into hiding, and ultimately destroyed her life. And if he was still out there, there was only one thing left to do. I had to find him before he found me. I sat at my desk, my laptop screen glowing in the darkness. Every instinct told me I should go to the police, but I had seen how that had worked in the past. Daniel had always slipped through the cracks. No, if I wanted the truth, I had to lure him out myself. I took a deep breath and logged into an old email I hadn't used in years. One I knew Daniel would recognize. Subject: we need to talk. Daniel. It's been a long time. I know what you did to Emily. I know everything. Meet me at the place where it all began. No more running. It's time we end this. Cassid. I hit send, my heart pounding. The place where it all began, this small diner where he had first taken me out all those years ago. I knew he would understand the message. And if I was right, he wouldn't be able to resist. I sat back, waiting. Minutes stretched into hours. And then, at 2:34 a.m., my inbox refreshed. One new message. My breath caught in my throat as I clicked it open. Tomorrow. Midnight. You better be alone. A chill ran through me. He was still out there. And now he knew I was coming. The diner parking lot was deserted, the neon sign flickering weakly in the cold midnight air. I stepped out of my car, my fingers wrapped tightly around the phone in my pocket, already recording. If anything happened tonight, I needed proof. A gust of wind sent shivers down my spine as I took slow, measured steps toward the entrance. And then I saw him. Daniel leaned against a rusted lamppost, his hands buried in his jacket pockets. His hair was shorter now, streaked with gray, but his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, hadn't changed. He smirked. Cassid. I was wondering when you'd stop hiding. Anger burned in my chest. I wasn't hiding. I just didn't know the truth. His smirk faltered for a split second. And what truth is that? I took a step closer, my fists clenched. Emily didn't run away with you. You forced her. You threatened her life and mine. Daniel sighed, shaking his head. You always were dramatic. I narrowed my eyes. She survived, Daniel. She got away from you. And now she's dead because of what you did to her. Something dark flashed in his expression. Emily made her choices. No, I spat. You made them for her. You spent years hunting her down, beating her, making sure she never came back to me. What kind of man does that? His smirk returned, colder than before. A man who doesn't leave loose ends. A sick feeling coiled in my stomach. He wasn't denying it. He never did. Because to Daniel, none of this was personal. It was just control. Power. I took a slow step back. You're going to pay for what you did. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. And how exactly do you plan on doing that? I pulled my phone from my pocket and turned the screen toward him. His own voice echoed from the speakers. A man who doesn't leave loose ends. His face darkened. I took another step back, my pulse hammering. You're done, Daniel. The police will hear everything. This time, you won't slip through the cracks. For a moment, he just stared at me. Then, without warning, he lunged. I stumbled back, barely dodging as his fingers grazed my wrist. My heart slammed against my ribs as I turned and ran. Footsteps pounded behind me. I pushed forward, sprinting toward the diner's back alley, my lungs burning. Then, suddenly, silence. I turned, breathless, my back pressed against the cold brick wall. Daniel stood a few feet away, his chest rising and falling rapidly. But something had changed. His expression was no longer confident. It was panic. Then I heard it, the distant wail of police sirens. I let out a shaky breath, gripping my phone tighter. I sent it to them before I came here. They've been listening this whole time. Daniel's face twisted into rage, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought he might explode. Then, without another word, he turned and ran into the darkness. But this time, he wouldn't escape. Red and blue lights flashed against the alley walls as officers flooded the scene. I stood frozen, my chest heaving as they chased after him. Minutes later, a shout rang through the night. We got him. I sank to the ground, my whole body trembling. It was over. After 10 years, after so much pain, it was finally over. The next morning, I sat across from my mother at the police station, a cup of untouched coffee in my hands. "They arrested him an hour ago," I said quietly. "No more running. No more hurting anyone." Tears filled my mother's eyes, her hand reaching for mine. "Emily would be proud of you." A lump formed in my throat. She should have never had to protect me in the first place. She squeezed my hand. But she did. Because she loved you. And now, you've done the same for her. I closed my eyes, letting the weight of it all settle. Emily had spent her life running, sacrificing everything to keep me safe. And now, for the first time in a decade, she could finally rest. I took a deep breath, standing up. The nightmare was over. And as I stepped into the sunlight outside the station, I knew this was my new beginning. For Emily. For myself. And for the life I would finally get to live, free from the shadows of the past. The weight that had pressed against my chest for 10 years was finally lifting, yet I felt hollow inside. Daniel was behind bars, his past sins finally catching up to him. The evidence I had gathered, his confession, my recorded conversation, and his long-buried criminal history, was more than enough to ensure that he wouldn't walk free this time. The police had found additional victims, others who had suffered at his hands, but had been too afraid to speak out. Justice had been served. But it didn't bring Emily back. As I sat in my mother's living room, the silence between us was deafening. She stirred a cup of tea absent-mindedly, her gaze distant. I knew she was thinking about Emily, about all the years she had spent wondering if her daughter was safe, only to discover the heartbreaking truth too late. "I should have fought harder for her," I whispered, staring at the floor. "I should have tried to find her." My mother set her cup down and reached for my hand. "You didn't know, Cassid. And when you did what she couldn't. You stopped him." I swallowed hard, guilt gnawing at me. She spent 10 years running because of me. Because she thought he would hurt me if she didn't leave with him. She didn't think, Cassid. She knew. My mother's voice was firm. She knew exactly what kind of monster Daniel was. And she knew he wouldn't stop until she gave him what he wanted. But she made a choice she thought would keep you alive. And she did. You survived because of her. Tears burned at my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Emily had lived in terror, sacrificed her happiness, her safety, her life, all to protect me. I had spent years hating her, cursing her name, believing she had destroyed my life when all along, she had been the only one trying to save it. And now, I was alive. I was free. Because of her. A week later, I found myself standing at Emily's gravesite, the wind rustling through the trees. Her tombstone was simple, her name etched into the cold marble. I traced the letters with my fingers, my chest tightening. I had spent years believing I would never see her again, and now, here she was right in front of me, but gone. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I should have known. I should have tried harder." The wind carried my words into the air, but there was no response. No sign of her. Just the quiet hum of the world moving forward. I closed my eyes, inhaling deeply. "I won't forget you, Em. I won't let your sacrifice be in vain." For the first time in years, I felt the anger slip away. The resentment, the bitterness, it all faded into something softer. Something lighter. Peace. I set a small bouquet of white lilies against her grave and stood. "Rest now, Emily. You don't have to run anymore." And neither did I. 3 months passed and life, for the first time in a decade, felt like mine again. I left my job in the city, moved into a quieter town, and started fresh. I had spent too long living in the past, allowing it to define me. But now I had a second chance. I started volunteering at a local women's shelter, helping those who had been trapped in abusive situations. It felt right, like a way to honor Emily, to carry forward the love she had for me by giving it to others who needed it. One evening, as I locked up the shelter for the night, I felt something shift inside me. A sense of hope. Of possibility. Emily had spent her life looking over her shoulder, waiting for the past to catch up with her. But I refused to do the same. For the first time in 10 years, I wasn't afraid anymore. I was free. And that, more than anything, was what my sister had always wanted for me. The past no longer held me captive. For so long, I had lived in the shadows of betrayal, grief, and unanswered questions, but now the truth had set me free. Emily had sacrificed her own happiness, her own life, to protect me from a monster I had once called my husband. And though I would never get the chance to thank her, I could honor her in the way I chose to live. I sat on a park bench one evening, watching the sun set over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. A soft breeze rustled through the trees, and for a moment, I let myself imagine that Emily was there beside me. I could almost hear her voice, gentle, teasing, full of life. "You made it, Cassid." Tears pricked my eyes, but they were different this time. Not the bitter tears of regret or sorrow, but something lighter. A release. I had spent 10 years believing I had lost everything, but I hadn't. I still had a future. I still had a life to live. And most importantly, I had Emily's love, woven into every step I took forward. I stood, taking one last deep breath of the evening air before heading home. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what lay beyond. As I walked away, I whispered a final promise into the wind. "I'll live, Emily, for both of us." And with that, I stepped into the next chapter of my life, leaving the past behind, where it belonged.